Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. I've talked a bit about why people have stayed with Trump, and I've written quite a bit about that in my Trump trilogy with liberal currents. Another big part of the story of why the 2024 election was lost is the Democratic vote went from 81 million votes for Joe Biden to 75 for Kamala Harris. And the whole thing just felt less unified, less cohesive. So a common question I've got is, what's up with that? This episode is my answer to that, at least in part. I've come up with a novel political spectrum for mapping that space. Now, this is an abstraction, a tool, and I'm being a bit silly here in a lot of ways, but I think it helps us think it through better. For the more practically minded, I do end with two practical payoffs. What this model would say to the left about how they can be successful in creating a democratic Tea Party, if that's what they're after, whereas before they failed at that. And for liberals and the Democratic Party more broadly, about what paths forward will work. I try and think through what's in mainline Dems' heads when they're saying stuff that seems dumb to me, and I think this model helps explain some of that. Just before I get started, I want to thank my audience on Blue Sky, who I posted some really long threads, some of which you'll see sort of find their way into this episode, and got useful feedback from people that helped me modify this model and just sort of think it through, and I quote some people in the episode. I'd also like to thank my wife, Irina Tavera, and my friend, Ivy Valentine, for just talking through this with me and helping me just think about it out loud. So thank you both to them. One final point I'll make about this episode is this is a critical episode, literally in the sense that I criticise a lot in it. I criticise what I call mainline liberals, I criticise what I call the anti-establishment left, and I definitely criticise what I call reactionary centrists. I think it's the time for criticism, quite frankly. I think if anyone looks, a 20,000-yard view of the anti-Trump coalition and asks, are we succeeding or not right now, the answer has to be that we're not. Now, don't get me wrong, the blame for the harms of Trumpism belongs with Trump and the people who back him and the people who vote for him. I'm not doing a blame the victim thing. I think where I'm critical is whether or not we end up stopping this. I think we could be a lot more unified than we are. I think there are structural problems within the coalition that we can solve. And I think many in the coalition have been very self-indulgent in their approach to politics, wallowing in what gives them gratification to say, rather than what is in the interest of all. I say all that to say, if you're not ready for an episode in which you and what you believe gets criticised after that loss, that is fine, and maybe give this one a miss. Political losses hurt, especially ones as consequential as this, and it's okay to take some time to grieve that loss and grieve the country we just lost. For those who are ready for the critical conversation, let's get started. This is Mapping the Anti-Trump Coalition with me. It's been conventional wisdom for quite some time that what unites the anti-Trump coalition is just that, being anti-Trump. That there's all sorts of things that are different about the various groups that came together to give Biden 81 million votes in 2020, but we all don't like Donald Trump, and that sort of kept us all in line. Now, that may be true for 2020, for, say, that election year and the 6 months afterwards, but it wasn't true in 2016, and it's become clear really during and for quite some time now, but certainly since the 2024 election, that we are really very divided and that we are really very angry at each other. What's challenging, though, is that these divides don't seem to map to a conventional political spectrum. So in other words, you've got left wing on one side, right wing on the other, centrist in the middle. This is partly about centrists versus the left, but I've also I've also been involved in very heated discussions between people who are both well to the left on most policy issues, but nonetheless seem to have real points of contention and disagreements with each other. There also seem to be real divisions on the centre. I think most of us would see that there's a difference between, say, Bill Kristol and Matt Yglesias, and we might prefer the former. I would take Bill Kristol over Matt any day. But what's at stake here? What's the difference that makes a difference? As I've said, I don't think the conventional political spectrum is capturing this that well. Certainly there's a difference between the centre and the left, or progressive liberals, or however you want to define that. But there's something else going on there. Now, dimensional models are just that. They're models. They're abstractions. And when they're not quite mapping, one of the things you can do is either use a different model or add dimensions. So in other words, instead of just left and right, let's say we have on one axis, the horizontal axis, left and right economically, and then on the other axis, let's say left and right socially. So you've got attitudes on the horizontal axis towards tax spending, the welfare state, say, and then on the other axis you've got attitudes towards gay rights, immigration, abortion, stuff like that, say, and then that gives you 4 quadrants. Now, as dimensional models go, and I've generally been a critic of dimensional models for what it's worth, self-cite, see my article, Surveying Ideology in Mass Populations 2013 in the Journal of Political Ideologies, for me making the argument about why dimensional models are unhelpful. But they are useful simplifications and they're visualizable. You can just put it on paper and you can see it and kind of anyone can understand what you're talking about. It occurs to me that even the sort of economic left-right versus social left-right still isn't really, while all of these are abstractions, that's not usefully mapping what's going on with the anti-Trump left. There has been parts of that. Like, I argued in the 2020 Democratic primary that there was a bit of a divide in who went for Sanders and who went for Warren between to what extent people emphasised economic justice versus social justice. Bernie, I think, tended to carry the economic justice people, and Warren, to a lesser degree, and at least initially she faded out, but tended to carry the social justice people. I'm not sure that's what's dividing us here. When I talk about some of this inter-left acrimony, or just disagreement, I don't know that it's like social justice people against economic justice people. I don't think that's what it is, or at the very least that's not an abstraction that is useful. It doesn't really do any work in the world. It doesn't map to the data or help us construct narratives. So I was thinking about this. I was thinking, is there a simple model that would track the anti-Trump coalition? Separately, I've spent a bit of time discussing agency and narratives, so I've written what I call my Trump trilogy, which is 3 articles about why Donald Trump won in 2024 for Liberal Currents. So those are on my website, or just search my name, Toby Buckle, and Liberal Currents, if you want to read those. But what I'm doing in all of them is I'm looking at the stories that we tell about the election. So, for instance, in the first one, I'm looking at the argument that people moved right because of economic anxiety. In the second one, I'm looking at the argument that men particularly moved right because of concerns about dating or feminism or so on. I'm looking at those narratives and I'm looking at particularly what the role of agency is in them. And again, these narratives, like the model, aren't literally true. We're talking about a nation of 320 million souls. The world is too complex. These narratives, like a left-right spectrum, are parables. But there are more or less useful parables. There are parables that are well supported by facts and those that are less so. My argument has been the narratives I've described, it's because of economic anxiety, or it's because young men are struggling to get dates, or another one, which I didn't discuss but I would disagree with for similar reasons, is it's because of trans people. Like all of these newfangled pronouns and gender identities, that was just too much and it pushed people right. These are all narratives that I think generally aren't good. And one of the things I've noticed and challenged, and I'm not the only person to do this, certainly, in all of those narratives, is they all have a very non-agental view of the right. Put simply, they all describe the right as reacting rather than acting. The right aren't doing things, they're responding to things that we do. There's a descriptive element to that, and there's also a moral element to that. If they're responding to what we do, is it partially our fault? I coined an intentionally ugly phrase to characterise this, which has kind of taken off on Blue Sky a bit. I called it, "What did you say to make him hit you? Politics." And this is actually in my Gender, Trump and Getting It solo episode as well. I'm self-citing a bit here, sorry. Essentially, what I'm noticing is the way that non-agental accounts can displace blame. So instead of saying, John hit Mary, which centres agency on John, and we ask, why did John do this? We say, what did Mary say to provoke him? Centres agency on Mary. But it also shifts blame over to her as well. Maybe she shouldn't have said that, right? Now, I coined that term to criticise non-agental accounts because, while no narrative is literally true, I find these correspond to facts worse. Every bit of data in the world shows that the main correlate of Trump support is attitudes towards race. It's not whether someone's successful as dating, it's not their economic circumstances, and honestly a very small percentage of the electorate vote on trans rights. There's not a big anti-trans voting bloc. So I don't think these narratives are true, but also I don't think they're helpful. And there's something actually morally questionable about them, I think. But it got me thinking, just to understand what's happening, why did the Democrats fail in 2020 when we didn't, in 2024, when we didn't in 2020? Because on paper, Donald Trump's the same guy. If anything, he's gotten worse since then. And our coalition are like, it's the same people, we believe the same stuff. Why did 6 million people stay home? Right? How do we just, understand those divides? That's what this episode is about, and that's what I'm going to try and answer here. What if, instead of social or economic, what if we made the vertical axis how agental or non-agental is your account of Trump and MAGA? Here's what I'm trying to drive at, and the basic insight, if we think there is insight in what I'm going to argue. What divides the anti-Trump coalition is how we see Trump. We all say that we're against him, but we differ in our accounts of where he came from and what to do about it. So I'm not going to be arguing for or against a gentle or non-gentle counts of the modern right. Not this time anyway. I'll be very plain about where I stand with it. I'm not beating around the bush there. But in this, I'm really just trying to describe. So to start with, what do I mean by a gentle? To be an agent, to be a decision maker, to be the centre of the story. As a very simple example, if someone at work says, "Why did you email the client?" One answer could be, "Because I thought they should know about X." Another answer could be, "My boss told me to tell them X." So you've got a more and a less a gentle answer, right? One emphasises you as the decision maker, your agency. The other, someone else as the decision maker, their agency. Likewise, our narratives about Trump's support can either emphasise agency on the right or emphasise agency elsewhere. So let me just give you, very quick, a few sentences each, some narratives about where Trump came from. And just think in your head. I'm not asking if you agree or disagree, just where are they locating agency? Narrative number one, Trump is appealing to what we might call the Southern identity, commitments around race, gender and religion, and he's doing so much more overtly than past Republicans have. He's directly appealing to racism. He's also spreading racism. On gender, the modern right is aggressively indoctrinating men into misogyny and then politicising that. That's the sort of recruitment process and where this support comes from. So that's narrative one. That's kind of my narrative that I defended in my Trump trilogy. Narrative 2. Since at least the Reagan era, America has been much more unequal. Wages haven't grown for those at the bottom. Americans are struggling financially, working multiple jobs to get by, and they are frustrated. The Democratic Party has abandoned the working class. It has not been answering their concerns, and in their desperation and frustration, they moved to someone who was at least providing answers. That's narrative 3. That's narrative 2, sorry. So call that the sort of left argument. Narrative 3, let's call this the centrist argument. Social justice has gone way too far. Every college campus is filled with screeching blue-haired reactionaries who are yelling about this, that, and the other. Trans people are now forcing everyone to use newfangled made-up pronouns. You really can't say anything anymore. You can't even tell a joke. And people just find this incredibly frustrating. Like, it's just so annoying. And when Donald Trump comes along and says, "Yeah, I'm just going to say what we're all thinking," people like that. Trump's not a great guy, but, like, he is a product of that frustration with how unreasonable and silencing and just plain weird the social justice left has become. That's narrative 3. So I did my best there to sort of put those in terms, I don't agree with everything I've just said, but to put them in terms that would be recognisable to people who hold those beliefs. I don't think I'm parodying or putting words in people's mouths. I think these are real things that real people believe, right? So all I'd call attention to there is where's agency in those 3 stories, right? The first story has a lot of agency in it, right? This is something the right is doing. The second and the third story displace agency. Trump, again, is not an action, it's a reaction, right? The thing that's made it happen is coming from the left, the Democratic Party, social justice people, something. It's coming from somewhere else, right? That's what I want to make my horizontal axis here. Now, people will differ in what the something else is. It can be economic inequality, it can be social justice, it can be incivility, all sorts of things, right? But people generally organise themselves by how gentle their account is. Or so I'm claiming. My claim is that the space is usefully organised on one dimension, the horizontal by left and right, or centre and left, and on the other by a gentle and non-gentle accounts of the right. One note here. What I'm mapping is just the anti-Trump space, specifically reasonably political people who self-define as being anti-Trump. I'm not mapping conservatives. Like, if you tried to apply this to the right side of the political spectrum, I don't think that would work. I'm talking about the anti-Trump side, and within it really just the political half, right? By analogy, if I were mapping American Christianity, my map wouldn't even include the non-religious or non-Christians, and even within sort of nominal Christians, I wouldn't be looking at just anyone who'll say yes to the label or that they believe in God. I'm trying to map people by, like, would you self-identify as a Catholic or an evangelical or so on and so forth, right? By analogy, I'm looking at everyone who's anti-Trump and the people within that who have some, to sort of even get on the spectrum at all, you'd have to have some sort of narrative about where Trump came from, and you'd have to have some sort of set of policy commitments for me to put you as either left or centre. So, to put it one way, Biden had 81 million votes in 2020, call it 80 just for a nice round number. When you do, I've done a lot of door knocking for various political campaigns. Voters are a real mixture. Some have a real narrative in their heads about what's going on, and they sort of know where they stand, and they could probably say something like, I'm a democratic socialist, or I'm a progressive liberal, and have some idea of what those words mean. Some voters, it's like, well, I'm going to vote Trump because I was flicking through my cable TV channels and I don't like the order that they're in. Like, that's the rationale, So I would say, and this is very, I'm just kind of eyeballing this, but it's probably about half and half. Within that 80 million, you've maybe got 40 million who have a political position and have thought about who are self-consciously political, right? You've then got maybe, 30 million who are sort of less political liberals. They wouldn't really have like a super in-depth or maybe even any narrative about where Trump came from, or like exactly what they think about XYZ issues, but they generally vote Dem because, that's what their friends and family do, and that's how they think of themselves. So 40, I would say about half, more political members of the anti-Trump coalition, 30 million sort of less political liberals, and then let's say 10 million swing voters. These are can vote based on the order the TV channels are in, like anything can be going through their heads. Now those latter two groups are susceptible to messaging if the news is uniformly hostile to a particular candidate for an entire year. That will impact them at the margin. It's not like they don't think politically. But for present purposes, I am only charting that first 40 million. I am only looking at the more political half of the 2020 coalition, and maybe a few abstainers outside of that who would are still quite political and would still consider themselves to be anti-Trump. So that's all I'm looking at. Only, like, when you think about it, like, all of the conversation about what it is to be anti-Trump comes from that 40 million. But that, numerically is what, like 15% of America? It's actually not a massive group when you stop and think about it. But nonetheless, within that quite small minority of the country, that's where I'm focusing today. Let me maybe say one more word about agency. If this is still, like, not tracking as a way to divide up the space. Again, sort of what are the internal divisions within that 40 million most politically self-conscious anti-Trump people? I would say, when it comes to agental and non-agental narratives, there's kind of three components to that, or three implications to that. Three buckets. First is descriptive. That's what I've talked about. If I said, where is Donald Trump's support coming from? Is your story going to highlight something he or other conservatives did? Or is it going to highlight something that people outside of his coalition did? Liberals, social justice activists, the Democratic Party, you name it. Again, is it action or reaction? Just how do you describe the world? But that also has moral implications, right? Because if something else is causing it, then isn't that something else also to blame? What responsibility does the Democratic Party have here? What responsibility do social justice activists have? Shouldn't they think a bit more carefully about what they're saying, right? Now, it's that jump from the descriptive to the model that I'm critiquing in my phrase, what did you say to make him hit you? But I'm not doing a moral analysis here, I'm doing a descriptive one. I'm just noting that that is a difference. The final is emotional and attentional. People who have a high agency account tend to really fricking hate Donald Trump and not feel particularly strongly about the Democratic Party one way or the other. It's not that people with a non-agental account like Donald Trump, but they tend to focus more and be more exasperated by people on their own side. Here's like quite an easy divide between agental and non-agental in terms of this emotional component. Who gets on your nerves, basically? Something bad happens that Trump has done. Something in Elon Musk and Dodge, whatever. Is your immediate thought to go and post online, fuck Trump, he's awful, screw him? Or is your immediate account to go, why aren't the Democrats doing something? Right? Now, I think some people will say, just because I recognise the root causes of Trump doesn't mean that I'm pro-Trump. I'm not quite saying that. I'm not saying that. These people are anti-Trump. But where's your focus and where's your sense of outrage located? One analogy I've heard a great deal from people who are on the political left but have a non-agental account is when I push them a bit on this and say, you do seem to be more angry at Democrats. They'll use what I call the firefighter analogy. So they'll say, look, if my house is burning down and the firefighters show up but refuse to put it out, they're just making all these excuses about, we've got to fill in some paperwork before we put your house out. Who am I more mad at there? The fire or the firefighters? Now, I've heard that literally dozens of times at this point, and yeah, that's what I'm saying here, right? Is they don't like the fire. They don't think the fire's good. The fire's Donald Trump in this analogy, by the way. But they don't see it as having agency. Fire doesn't have agency. It's just a physical process, right? It doesn't make any sense, really, to be mad at the fire. It's dangerous, and you should recognise the danger, but you're going to reserve your anger for the people who have agency. Let me give you another example. And I'm just staying within the political left side here. How do you feel about the act of voting? One of the things that interests me a lot is this emotional side. I think we just feel differently about how we vote because, this follows from agency, but if you have a high agency account of the right, then as long as the other person on the ballot is a normal political party, as long as they're not also a fascist, voting against fascists is the most no-brained thing in the world, right? People are doing bad things. This is something I can do to stop them. If, however, you have a low agency or a non-agency account, it's a bit more complicated, actually, because from your perspective, the fascist, the Donald Trump, whoever, is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is neoliberalism, in this case, right? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the Democratic Party is a neoliberal party who enacts neoliberalism when elected, again, just say. Well, then you're faced with a bit of a dilemma. You're being offered a medicine that will treat the symptoms of the disease, but make the disease worse. Say you have liver failure, and that's causing skin discoloration, say. And it's bad and it's painful and it looks terrible. And I offer you a cream that will help the skin discoloration. It will be a pain relief, but it has side effects that it makes your liver worse. Do you take it? Well, it's a conundrum, right? And that is, I think, how a lot of people on the left view the act of voting. They just feel differently about it. They feel very, very conflicted about it. They feel like even if they're willing to acknowledge, and many are, that Donald Trump will be worse in terms of his consequences, they don't want to do it. And I think actually it's that feeling that's primal, that's primal, yes, certainly, but prime, that's the first thing, that's from what we're working back from. I said in my Getting It narrative that some people just feel the danger of Trump. They feel that this is real. It's not a reaction, it's not a game, it's not about something else. This is the thing, this is the most important thing we can be fighting. Some people just get that, and they work backwards from that feeling. I think some people really don't want to vote for the Democratic Party, and they sort of work backwards from that. Feeling isn't bad. I love my wife. That's a feeling. It's not bad. I've grieved people. That's a feeling. It's not a positive one, but it's a part of life. I'm sometimes angry at people. That's a feeling that's maybe less good. I'm not saying when I say we're all working from feeling here, I'm not saying anything bad. I'm just noting that there is this very emotional component to it. Now, that's not all that's going on with left abstention. There's other issues such as people's expressive identity, issues of purity, theories like accelerationism, about wanting a multi-party system. There's a lot of stuff overlapping with left abstention. But I've also heard people describe a feeling of revulsion, a feeling of dirty hands, a feeling of, when they did vote Democrat, having to force themselves to do it. Well, that is just a difference, right? And I think it very tracks and correlates with these ideas of agency. Now, those feelings don't come from nowhere, and I could do a whole episode on where they come from. For instance, this vertical axis, a gentle versus non-gentle thing, is gendered. A lot of this is about how we perceive gender. The move to de-agentify an agent and blame another agent is this is, again, why I say, what did you say to make him hit you? It's very much something we do to displace blame from men, and we make the exact equivalent move with male-coded entities, like the Republican Party. to displace blame on to female-coded entities like liberalism as an ideology or social justice or the Democratic Party. Now, I'm not going to focus on that here, but just one of the comments I got a lot when I sort of ran through this online was it feels like there's a real gender component to this. Yeah, absolutely. The vertical axis is gendered, but like I say, in this, I'm just trying to describe the space and think it through, not make a moral argument. If I were to make a moral argument, then yeah, the way this works in connectivity with misogyny would be a big part of that moral argument. But I'm just thinking it through in sort of fairly dry terms here. So, section number the second. The map that this produces for us. Again, highly imperfect abstraction. This is not the real world. This is a parable, or a visual parable. I do think it kind of helps you think things through. Now, by the way, I made this map the cover image for this episode, and it's also on the episode page for this on the website, so it might be useful to just look at this as I'm talking about it. But, you don't have to. I'm not the boss of you. You've got two axes. Do you see the right as agental or non-agental? And are you towards the centre or the left? And again, this is for your sort of 40 million most political people in the anti-Trump coalition, so-called, right? Now, people can be more moderate and more extreme here. Someone might be quite close to the axis, either horizontally or vertically. You can be kind of centre of the left, right? You're not a centrist, but you're not a hardcore lefty either. You can also be fairly central on the agental one. You can sort of partly see it as you can say, oh, look, it's partly white supremacy and it's partly economic angle. It's a bit of both, right? Plenty of people hold that view. In fact, I would say, actually, the sort of centre of gravity for Democratic Party messaging is somewhere actually at the centre of this graph. It's one of the reasons the Democrats can just sound so vapid in their messaging, is they're trying to appeal to all four quadrants, and the more they move into one, the more they're going to alienate the others. Now, individual Democratic politicians, and I'll get to this, sort of scatter around. You'll find them in most of the quadrants, although to different degrees. Let's start at the top left. So these are people who are generally progressive in their ideology. They want a better welfare state, more healthcare provision, more egalitarianism. They support LGBT rights. They want abortion to be legal, so on and so forth, right? And because, again, we're only dealing with quite a small chunk of America, these are some of the most progressive people in the society. In addition to that, they tend to have a gentle view of Trump. He is the primary problem, and where did he come from? He came from racism and sexism and conservative religion and xenophobia. People propagate those ideas, and this is the political expression, right? I've come up with a term for all of these quadrants, which is, again, a simplification for tens of millions of people. I called this quadrant mainline libs, mainline liberals. This, I really want to note, will not be one-for-one with self-definition. Whenever you define people by some external criterion, that's not going to match perfectly how those people define themselves, because people define themselves in all sorts of ways. I would guess, though, that if you asked people in that quadrant to define themselves, the most common response you would get is liberal. What are your political beliefs? I think they'd either say left-wing or liberal. Right, maybe they'd say progressive liberal or qualify it in some other sort of way. But it's not universal. You will get people who identify as leftists who are in that quadrant. You will get people who are very, hardcore about their politics and being very extremely left-wing, but also do emphasise the sort of agental factors in Trump. A good example of this would be AOC. I would say AOC probably started her career sort of as a moderate anti-establishment left, somewhere in the quadrant below it. She started by talking a lot about, people have been pushed here by neoliberalism and economic desperation. When she first came into her politics, she had a lot of people on her staff who spent all their time feuding with more mainstream Democratic Party people online, and she eventually, and I think sensibly, let them go. And perhaps as Trump has really singled out her by name a lot, has much more focused on gentle narratives. She spends now, I would say, more time attacking Republicans than Democrats. She seems more focused on that. She's also been very, very hardcore to the displeasure of some on the left that Donald Trump is an existential danger and he cannot be allowed to win elections. Whatever the sort of internal issues and disagreements within the Democratic Party are, they are secondary to that, which I would say, in my model, would put her in the mainline liberal box. But I think she still self-identifies as a democratic socialist, and fine, right? Like, this model isn't, the labels I'm putting are not going to be one for one with the labels people themselves use. I'm just trying to give a sense of where each quadrant is. Going one down, we have what I'm calling the anti-establishment left. Bernie Sanders would be in this category, although moderately so, and it depends on the era. 2016 Bernie Sanders very much went in for the economic anxiety narrative. 2020 through 2022 Bernie Sanders was actually possibly moved at least onto like the border with mainline libs. He was quite a strong backer of Biden's agenda. And then after 2024, his statement was, and I quote directly, "Democrats abandoned the working class." That was his account of why we'd lost. Well, that is a very sort of classic non-agental narrative, so that puts him, I would say, somewhere in the middle of that bottom left quadrant. Even further down, you'd have like DSA, you'd have all your socialist groups, you'd have like the online left, people who post all the time about what the Democrats are doing wrong. Sometimes justifiably, sometimes less so, but very much their focus and their anger is on the Democrats. Again, firefighter analogy, right? Moving to the right, we have what I've called reactionary centrists. Again, not one for one with self-definition. I don't think anyone in this category would self-describe as a reactionary socialist, but it's a reactionary centrist. But it's a term I've heard a lot, and it does kind of capture, like, what I'm talking about here. These are centrists. They probably vote Democrat, but they're just, their whole thing is, like, complaining about social justice and nitpicking the left and hand-wringing about civility. Think people who write New York Times columns, right? Yeah, they probably vote Democrat. They don't like Trump. They acknowledge Trump is worse. But my God, these trans people, right? We're going to really, at very best, launder and at worst, outright market all of these anti-trans talking points that we're seeing spring up. They're going to go on and at length about every rhetorical excess and supposed strategic misstep of social justice movements. They're going to be very, very concerned about, like, the pro-Palestine movements on college campuses. They're really going to be in for decorum and civility and all of that. Those are reactionary centrists. And then the final one, top right. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just call it the anti-Trump center. This would be someone like Bill Kristol, Ann Applebaum, Republican commentators, maybe someone like David Frum, who's sort of moved from the sort of moderate Republican into the Democratic Party, might go here. They're generally not super progressive, but they are very anti-Trump. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but they're worth noting that they do exist. There are people who are sort of centrist in their politics, maybe even centre-right, but have a very gentle account of Trump. Trump is someone who's, in their eyes, trying to destroy the American Constitution. They tend to be, I'm sort of noticing, people who are quite concerned about foreign policy. You've got like some neocons and stuff in there, a lot of Bush-era people. I think because Trump's so vigorously anti-NATO, and the small percentage of the Republican Party who apparently were actually serious about promoting democracy worldwide have become very anti-Trump. So those are your 4 quadrants. Now, here's what's interesting about them, and here's, I think, what explains a lot of the acrimony, a lot of the strategic failure, and a lot of the plain just frank weirdness within the anti-Trump coalition. Again, the sort of 40 million or so most self-consciously political people who say that they're anti-Trump. They're all very different in terms of size, and they're all very different in terms of messaging reach. But here's what's weird. Number of voters inversely correlates with messaging reach. And I hadn't really thought about this before I'd drawn up this map, and when I did, I was like, yeah, that's what's going wrong. Like, this is the problem, right? So numbers, I'm ballparking these, but it's based on real data. Mainline Liberals, 25 to 30 million voters. This is by far numerically the biggest group within... This is the Democratic primary electorate. These are the people who vote in Democratic primaries. This is the most loyal part of the Democratic base. That in one form or another, they're generally quite progressive, certainly relative to the median voter. They're very progressive relative to the median voter, but they also have a gentle account of Trump. Their main thing is being anti-Trump. They don't see Trump as a symptom of someone else. I'm sort of basing that number on survey data, what I know about the voting behaviour of different demographic groups, and also just a sort of revealed preference, like what candidates they will back in a primary. The stereotype of these people is like a suburban mum who has a sign in her front garden saying, in this house we believe science is science, love is love. Do you know the ones I'm talking about? Often gets called resist libs, wine mums. Okay, I said I wasn't going to talk about gender, but are you seeing the gendered component here? They are talked about derisively in overtly gendered terms. Now, to an extent, that stereotype isn't incorrect. Mainline Liberals are disproportionately women, although not all women are mainline Liberals. But the way we kind of come up with a negative stereotype that's gendered, I'll just note that, and I'll move on. But yes, certainly that stereotype, as sort of misogynistic as it is a real person. I don't think we need to sort of sneer at them. A lot of sort of middle-aged women. Middle-aged liberal women, right? That's a big base of the Democratic Party. I would also say, when we're thinking about this group, consider the older black voters who gave South Carolina and hence the Democratic primary nomination to Biden in 2020 and stayed in his camp his entire presidency, who went for him over Bernie Sanders and would have been within the roughly third of Americans who said they approved of Biden throughout his entire tenure. Right? By my account, they would be mainline liberals. They're among the most anti-Trump voters. They're pro-democratic party. They're not buying what the anti-establishment left is selling. And if you asked them, they would... I listened to quite a few interviews as part of that primary, and I've talked to people within that cohort a lot as part of my own political canvassing. I think if you ask them where Trump came from, what explains his support, the most common narrative you'd hear would be something like, well, when I was very young, we had the KKK, and this is the modern iteration of that. The far right has been much more expansive and aggressive recently. They're coming back. Like, that's something I've heard people say quite a lot, actually. Which is just to say that's the gentle account, right? So I would say 25, 30 million of the 40 million, by far the biggest chunk. Anti-establishment left, 6 million, maybe 8 on the high end. Where am I getting that figure from? That's about the Bernie Sanders primary vote in 2020, and even that I think is probably overstating it a bit. I'm not sure everyone in there was a committed leftist. I think some people were just along for the ride. Also a good benchmark. Do you view the Democratic Party as ideologically similar to yourself, more conservative than yourself, or more liberal than yourself? Do you view it as the same as you, to your left, to your right? About 5-6% of America, according to polls, see the Democratic Party as being to their right. In other words, they see themselves as being to the Democratic Party's left. So in an electorate of 140 million, 130 million, that would be, 7 or 8 million people see themselves as being more left-wing than the Democratic Party. So I'd say that's kind of a ceiling for how large this section could be. And I think that's probably overstating it. I would see myself as to the left of the median Democrat, and I'm straightforwardly a mainline liberal, according to this. So yeah, maybe 6 to 8 million. Anti-Trump centre, no one, really. In presidential elections, Biden has been able to carry 1 or 2% of, Republican voters who, maybe vote Republican down ballot, but have broken against Trump. Maybe something like that number corresponds to it, 2 to 3 million. Maybe. It's not they're there. These people do exist. I'd be amazed if it was higher than sort of low single digits of the electorate. Reactionary centrists? I mean, none really, right? Maybe 1 million. I'm tempted to say 1,000 people, all of whom are employed in legacy media. If you have these beliefs, you somehow also have a New York Times column. I'm being a bit facetious there. But that brings me to my second point, messaging reach. And it's inverse. Reactionary centrists, despite being the smallest group numerically, they define legacy media. This is the vast majority of people who write for the New York Times or the Washington Post or who are on cable news. And this is the legacy media that, unlike, say, Fox News, isn't just part of the conservative messaging machine. These people have reach. If they want us to talk about the price of eggs for 2 years, guess what we're going to talk about, right? Anti-Trump Centre. They actually do have reasonable media representation, at least relative to their size. Like I say, you have your sort of Bill Kristols and Ann Applebaums and so on. Like they have presence, they're there. They'll sometimes write a guest essay for the New York Times and so on. They have their podcasts, whatever. They're not the main voice in the conversation, but they're there. The anti-establishment left is not a big chunk of the electorate, and they don't have much of a voice in traditional media, but they are very, very overrepresented online. Probably the majority preference, not even of the left, but majority preference on Twitter in the old days and Blue Sky now, is, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say Bernie bro, but that person, right? I'm not even using that in a derogatory sense, but someone who would be pro-Bernie Sanders in a Democratic primary, who is definitely left-wing and is incredibly frustrated with the Democratic Party and spends a lot of time complaining about them. That's, I don't think I'm stereotyping, that's kind of like the median voice on social media, right? That's also probably the main voice within, like, YouTube essayists and podcasters and, people who just, like me, right? People who have 10,000 followers online and yell about politics a lot. I'm somewhat atypical there in that I'm a mainline lib. Most, I would say, are anti-establishment left, or at least sort of moderate between the two. Mainline libs, actually, despite the perception that we define the conversation, have almost no media representation at all, and I'm going to come back to that point. Here's the challenge for the Democratic Party. Now we have this map. We've got our mainline liberals, anti-establishment left, reactionary centrists, anti-Trump centre, if you're all sort of with me so far in what I'm visualising. Here, in a nutshell, is what happened from 2020 to 2024 that I think quite easily and neatly explains that drop-off of 6 million votes that was pretty determinative. In 2020, Biden carried all 4 quadrants. Just, and with a certain amount of reluctance and moaning, but he did. As his term went on, however, the reactionary centrists really soured on him. The press coverage became incredibly hostile, and not just from your Fox News and OANs like your New York Times, went from being a bit dithery, but at least sort of saying Trump is lying about the election, it wasn't stolen, and, not being completely feckless, to now completely feckless. And again, the reactionary centrists don't represent many, or indeed any, voters, but they have reach. And the press coverage for the last 2 or 3 years of his term, mainly on economics, increasingly they've been worked up about trans people, was relentlessly negative. We are going to talk about the price of milk. Biden also quickly lost the anti-establishment left. They did not like voting for him in 2020, and I think increasingly came to see it as a one-time thing and resented being asked to do it again. We voted for you to block fascism. You were supposedly going to return things to normal and, by the way, be a one-term president. What's that about? And then, of course, Gaza happens, which I think confirmed them in that view. Now, they don't represent that many voters, but they represent some. I think there was fall-off in that sort of section of voting. And they don't have, as much messaging power as the reactionary centrists, but they have some. They set the mood, they set the tone, and they set the vibe online. This is essentially the difference, then, between 2020 and 24. We lost some votes on the left, I think. But as much as anything, our messaging apparatus, both the people who talk about politics online and the people who set the agenda in legacy media, was not just not with us, it was against us. And this, at the margin, drove us down with those less political groups I talked about. Everyone within that 40 million most political anti-Trump who has messaging power, be it the person with 10,000 followers who vents about politics online, all the way up to someone with 500,000 followers who has a column with the New York Times, with only a few exceptions, was, even if they voted Democrat, and probably most of them did, was very, very, very negative about Biden and the Democratic Party for at least the last 2 years of his presidency. And the, less political left and your sort of eclectic swing voters, they're not following every story or whatever, but if it's as relentless as that will impact at the margin. Plenty of people on the less political left, they're not going to vote Republican, but they might just forget about it. This is something, people are all the time like, oh yeah, the election was yesterday, wasn't it? If you're super political, that seems bizarre, but a lot of people just kind of forget. Or figure that it's not worth it, because, it seems like Biden's been doing a pretty poor job, and, I don't think, people are, like, really listening to everything that you tweet online, but it just goes into the general mood right? That's the difference, I think. 2020, we had all 4 quadrants. 2024, we only had the top 2. Let me then, having explained my model, close by just working through it a little bit. What can we do with this? How can we think about things? I'll say a few words each about liberals, the anti-establishment left, and reactionary centrists. The anti-Trump centre, sure, cool, it's nice to have you guys as part of the coalition. I don't think are, like, strategically important. Sorry. And to their great credit, I think they're aware of that. They're just not that many people. Let's start with liberals. Thinking about things in terms of this framework has given me a bit of a better handle on what's going wrong with liberals. Basically, despite being the largest section of voters, mainline liberals, again in this definition, and that might not be one-for-one with self-definition, have lost a lot of their representation in both traditional and new media. And they've done so basically without a fight. Now, legacy media like the New York Times has always been the preserve of reactionary centrists. But mainline liberals at least had a voice. That's changed. Even a fairly normie mainline lib like Paul Krugman has proved too much for them. Krugman, to my mind, would be like centre of that quadrant. He's generally on the left. He's not like a communist, but he's definitely to the left of like the centre of the American spectrum. And he calls Republicans on their shit. For quite a while now, he's been centering just like on how much Republicans just lie about stuff has been a big part of his coverage. And apparently he was pushed out of the New York Times for that latter reason. You could be a bit progressive, maybe, but this, like, calling Republicans on their shit thing apparently is just no longer the order of the day. And I think that's really unfortunate. I grew up reading Paul Krugman's columns. I've read, I think, every book he's ever published, apart from, like, the academic textbooks or whatever. And that was a big part for me of just sort of understanding the economic side of things. You know, from the anti-establishment left point of view, it's all just neoliberalism or capitalism. But, like, what are the differences between how the centre-left and the centre-right want to govern economically? I think that's really important to have in your head. And I think it's just important that mainline liberalism represents itself. And where are the Paul Krugman's still around, he's got a Substack, but where are the Paul Krugmans today? People who are sort of middle of the left and strongly like Republicans are lying to you. You know, where's that voice? Or, I said before, think about the black voters who gave South Carolina to Biden and stayed with him more or less throughout his presidency. Where are they, right? Where's the press representation of them? Where's the person who has a column in the New York Times or a podcast or YouTube channel with equivalent reach to that, who looks like them either ideologically or demographically? I.e., who has that sort of messaging power, who is over 60, black, and without a college degree? I'm not thinking of anyone off the top of my head. Who has that type of messaging power, who supported Joe Biden in the 2020 primary and generally had positive things to say about him throughout his entire presidency? Again, I'm of someone who has reach, either in traditional or new media. I'm not. Write me if there's someone I'm missing here, but I'm not. Like, as far as I can see, all of the endorsements in new media were for Sanders or maybe Warren, and then the endorsements in traditional media were for like Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, like maybe Warren on their good days. Who wanted Biden? Even Obama didn't endorse him. or for that matter, who generally has had positive things to say about Biden throughout his entire presidency. You might think that's wrong or whatever, and fine. I'm just saying, where's that voice? But that, both the demographic description I gave you and the ideological description I gave you, which obviously aren't one for one, there's people who hold those ideological views who aren't older and black and so on, but either these are tens of millions of voters. Where are they in our conversation? If anything, it's worse in new media. The Democratic Party and mainline liberalism, when it comes to social media, YouTube, podcasts, liberals, have had an almost Whiggish snobbery about this. They've bemoaned that no one reads broadsheets anymore, while those very rags lurch hard to the right. It's also just worth saying that the core Dem vote isn't very online. One of the dumber things in the 2020 primary that, I found that particular voter sort of a useful benchmark for what I'm talking about here, is people said, oh, this is because Bernie bros are too mean online. I sort of agree. I think that section of the left could stand to be less acerbic, but that's your description of what went wrong in the South Carolina primary. The people who... the black church-going retirees who gave that to Biden are not invested in the Twitter wars. They know better than that, right? That wasn't what happened. The core Democratic vote just isn't very online. One result of this, I think, this media invisibility, is both reactionary centrists and the anti-establishment left have less of an idea what liberals think. They don't see us, they don't hear us defending ourselves in our own words. And they've come to hate us more. To take just the left, they don't really see mainline libs in their online world. What they see are reactionary centrists and the anti-Trump centre, because they have visibility, and they assume that that's what liberals are. And they hate reactionary centrists, because reactionary centrists are very hateable. The anti-establishment left isn't wrong to get wound up by those people. But the result is a much worse impression of liberalism, and it's just locked in at this point. The number of times, and this is both in person and online, I've discussed things with a lefty, and they just ascribe to me all sorts of beliefs. You liberals believe this. You liberals are so obsessed with civility. And I say I have been a critic of the idea of civility, at least as commonly used, for 10 years now. And they just go, yeah, well, doesn't that just show you're wrong? Like, me telling them those aren't my views doesn't help. They literally don't believe me. They don't think liberals are actually progressive or actually anti-Trump. Now, not all of that is liberalism's fault. I think there is a lot of blame to go round here in that we seem to have just not put ourselves out there. We've just not put ourselves out there. And we've allowed others to define the space without a fight. And that is to our discredit. At the same time, both reactionary centrists and anti-establishment lefties are, at best, insular and incurious, and at worst, actively hostile to new perspectives. They talk to themselves, put simply. They're liberals. What they imagine a liberal to be is a caricature of their own creation. Or, to use the online parlance, they make up a guy to get mad at. So it's both. It's both stereotyping from the other quadrants and that liberals haven't represented themselves. One of my followers, Elizabeth Picuto, apologies if I got your last name wrong there, wrote this, which I thought summed up what I'm trying to say about mainline liberalism perfectly. Democrats, quote, Democrats represent an earnest, offline, majority women contingent who are ill-represented by both legacy and online media, which is not ideal. This lack of and adds a note that this lack of representation is contrary to popular belief, contrary also, bizarrely, to the belief of a large number of writers and editors at legacy media. Perfect. That's exactly what I was trying to say here. Dems represent an earnest offline majority women contingent who are ill-represented in legacy and online media. That is 1,000% true of what the core of the Democratic general electorate is, like the core, and what the Democratic primary electorate is. And exactly right also that legacy media believes liberals are overrepresented, when liberals, as I'm defining it, have almost no voice whatsoever. Next up, part the fourth. Let's have a quick look at the anti-establishment left through this model. First up, am I being unfair? When I first rolled this out, people who are in this quadrant didn't like it, essentially. Because in their heads, they're the most anti-Trump. And I'm saying they're the least anti-Trump. That's not quite what I'm tracking. Within their view, they are the most anti-Trump because they're dealing with the underlying cause, not just the symptoms. Also, I think more trivially, but still, they assume that they're the, quote, real opposition because they're the most rhetorically aggressive. Certainly the average person posting from a lefty perspective about politics online uses some stronger words than a mainline Democratic politician, right? And I think also, just being blunt, the anti-establishment left overestimates their own size. According to every bit of polling I've seen and implied behaviour from voters, this just can't be more than about 5% of the electorate, and even that I think is quite high. But I think they speak for the majority. Again, none of that's what I'm tracking. I'm tracking what role right-wing agency, or lack thereof, plays in our narrative, and I'm just taking people at their word. When Bernie Sanders says Trump was elected because Democrats abandoned the working class, I'm not inventing that quote, nor is it unrepresentative of what Bernie Sanders, with, as I say, maybe a brief exception at the early Biden presidency, has been saying throughout his career, right? When I talk about the firefighter analogy, this is something I've heard dozens of times from people on the left. That's not words I'm putting into their mouth. And I'm not reading some obscure meaning into that analogy. The point of the analogy is that they don't see the right as having agency, and their feelings follow from that. That's literally what that analogy is trying to communicate. I talked with someone online recently who, is a real person and has a large following, I think larger than me, and they were quite critical of this, but then after some discussion said in response to someone else, what you call normalcy is the result of a Democratic Party-backed neoliberalism that was designed to produce fascism. Well, okay, say what you will about that narrative. One thing I might note is it's just very non-agental for the right. This would be a sort of very extreme, right at the bottom of that axis statement, right? Not only is it caused by Democrats deliberately did it, according to this. Now, that's an extreme position. That's probably not representative of most of the people in this quadrant, but that is a real thing that I've heard. And again, not from some random person, from someone who is sort of a news source for a lot of people. So I don't think I'm caricaturing people, but people did feel caricatured. And, all I'd say is there's a difference. And there's also, I'd say, look, there's a difference in how we feel about voting. I literally couldn't, if there's a fascist on the ballot, do anything other than vote for the person best placed to beat them. As long as that person isn't also literally a fascist. I would just feel physically unwell leaving that ballot blank. A lot of people feel the opposite way. They feel like they're going to feel physically unwell or degraded or contaminated or dirty or revulsed by voting for the mainline Liberal. You might have different language to describe that difference, but that is a difference, and I think that's the main difference, actually. A lot of this, and I'll just say this and I'll leave it be, but this was the main criticism I got and I wanted to address it, is people in that quadrant felt I was being unfair to that quadrant. Is you get what I call Schrodinger's lefty, who simultaneously is being unfairly characterised as being anti-Dem, but he's also really genuinely very anti-Dem. So, I'll say something that says, I think we should make an effort to criticise Republicans at least as much as we criticise Democrats. By all means criticise Democrats, but let's not have that be the only thing that we do. And people will get very angry and very upset with me because they think, because what are you talking about? Of course that doesn't apply to me. That's not what lefties do, blah, blah, blah. And then you get into the discussion with them and they're like, well, obviously I criticise the Democrats more because the firefighter analogy, right? This is the sort of type of conversation where that comes up in. So they've got upset that I've ascribed to a belief to them that they then, once you get into it, turn out to aggressively hold, and often hold a much more extreme version of than the one I ascribed to them. Now, I think what's happening here is nothing more complicated than people feel like their team is under attack. It feels like when I'm saying they don't have a very strong role for right-wing agency in their accounts, that I'm saying something negative about them, which I kind of am, to be fair. And so they want to defend their team. So they say, no, that's wrong. And then you get into it, and they'll represent the actual view. I think all that's happening there is someone is defending their team without trying to be consistent or persuasive of me. They're just trying to win the interaction. And fine, right? Like, all different groups do this. I'm sure every section of the quadrant does that to some degree. I have noticed it's particularly true of this quadrant. But to address the narrative, like, I'm taking that I'm unfairly mischaracterising Bernie Sanders or the left or so on. I'm taking what you say, right? I'm taking you seriously. I'm taking what your expressions of feeling and your descriptions of the world at face value. So, here's why this perspective, though, even if it jars initially, might be quite useful to the anti-establishment left. Here's what I want to say. I think it provides a very, very, very clear explanation for why they can't win primary elections. Because the obvious answer is, if Democrats are so bad, primary them. Like in the UK, in Europe, the party leadership decides what candidates are on the ballot. Here, voters can have input. And some of these primary electorates for like Congress or whatever are 20,000 people. Like, you don't need to do a lot. Go, challenge people. And again they fail. They fail at the national level, as we've seen repeatedly with Sanders. They try again and again at congressional seats, whatever. Almost always they fail, and when they do take a seat like Jamal Bowman, they lose it again. Really, like someone like AOC is quite exceptional in having both taken and held a seat. Here's why. They mostly just talk to themselves in their anti-establishment left quadrant, online, and their messaging is tailored to that. The Democratic primary electorate are in the mainline Liberal quadrant, and that messaging doesn't work for them. And again, you see that is what trips them up. Let me give you a quick case study in this, because I can imagine someone thinking, I'm not really sure what the difference you're tracking to is. After all, both of these quadrants by your description are pretty left-wing. Indeed, that's not what's tripping left primaries up. It's not that they're too far to the left. The country as a whole is a bit iffy on, say, Medicare for all, but it polls reasonably well within this sort of most political 40%. of the anti-Trump coalition. Again, these are generally quite progressive people. It's not that. It's this agency question, right? People who vote in Democratic primaries generally quite like the Democratic Party, and they don't respond well to messaging that they see as trashing it, or more specifically, that they see as blaming it for the ills of Trump and Trumpism. Here's my case study. Let's have a look at the 2020 Democratic primary. I've mentioned that primary electorate a few times now. I want to play for you two clips. They're only a couple of minutes long each. One from Biden and one from Bernie. I'll do Biden first. This is him talking in a black church in South Carolina ahead of the primary there. And then I'll play you a Bernie clip, and this is from his New York Times endorsement interview. He didn't get the endorsement, but they interviewed all of them publicly. And in both cases, what they're sort of giving is their descriptive and moral account of where Trumpism came from. Now, what I don't want you to pay attention to is who's more rhetorically persuasive or who's a better speaker, nor even who you agree with more. I want you to ask, what role is being given to agency in both of these short clips that I'm going to show you? And as a result, what implied blame is there? How many people in this account are being blamed? Biden up first.
But you know what? As much as that was true, I underestimated one thing. I underestimated that hate's never defeated. It only hides. It hides. Because I never thought, I really got to give my word to this is Biden, I never thought I'd see a day that y'all saw in 2017 in Charlottesville. People coming out of the woods carrying torches. Their veins, close your eyes and remember what you saw. Their veins bulging, spewing hate and bitterness, carrying Nazi flags, accompanied by the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists. And a young woman was killed fighting the hate. And the president was asked, he said, what's your comment, Mr. President? He said something no president has said. Oh, we're going back to Andrew Johnson. He said there are some very fine people on both sides. No president has ever made that moral equivalence. And that's when all of you, along with me, decided we got to turn this god-awful position into something positive.
That was Biden, and here is Bernie in his New York Times interview.
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah. People are, in many cases in this country, working longer hours for low wages. You are aware of the fact that in an unprecedented way, life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope, and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide. And when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're going to have a good job, and you're going to have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we've got to do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority, and you demonize that minority, and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say that's the cause of your problem.
So what do you think? I'm not taking obscure people. I'm not, defining a movement by its most excessive people on Twitter, but approaching this through the lens of agency. Who has the more gentle account? Clearly Biden, right? Who's being blamed? Well, In Bernie, it's kind of both, right? He's blaming Trump. Trump is a demagogue. Trump is taking advantage of this economic anxiety. But he's also very clearly blaming both Republicans and Democrats for causing it, and the New York Times. And actually, you know what? Good for you, Bernie, for throwing that one in. But you can hear the kind of incredulity in the question as you're saying that's causing racism, not racist. Who's Biden blaming? Squarely Trump, right? Trump to him is the cause of this problem. It's not a symptom of someone else. Now, this is a big divide that the anti-establishment left runs afoul of again and again when it comes to messaging to primary electorates. I'm not even making the point about whether you're right or not here. I'm just saying why this messaging doesn't work. Another example that you could pick from the 2020 primary is what's each candidate's relation with Obama, right? Biden, even though he actually didn't have Obama's endorsement at this point, certainly acted like he did, very much, he said, I'm a Obama-Biden Democrat, as if that were a thing, very much tied him to Obama's legacy. I think Obama is, maybe not quite divine, but a step above human, was essentially how Biden was framing these things. Bernie said, and I quote, "Him and I talk occasionally but aren't the best of friends," end quote, when asked about his relationship with Obama. Now, let me ask you this. For the voters Biden was talking to in that church, which message do you think resonates more? Let me ask it a different way. If I were to ask someone who worked at a mid-level in Bernie Sanders' campaign to give me an account of Obama's presidency and who was responsible for its failings, they would say something like, Obama ran on hope and change, he got a lot of progressive people excited, but then he let us down and he turned out to be a neoliberal sellout. What would the voters Biden was talking to say? They would say Obama was a good man and a good president. Unfortunately, white people are racist as all hell, and once they saw a black man in the Oval Office, they lost their minds and they went in and voted in Republican majorities in Congress who absolutely blocked him on everything because they were racists and they were responding to racists who'd elected them. And what had started as a promising presidency, by Obama's own admission, didn't get everything done that he wanted to do. He's still a good man and a good president, but the forces of white racism and the Republican Party, which is its expression, constrained him. That's what they'd say, right? And here's the thing I'd really want to stress. They are substantively right to say that. One of the things that infuriated me about how the Bernie campaign thought internally about its failure to pick up, specifically in this case black votes in this primary, was it was always framed as some sort of failing of the black voters themselves. What do we need to do to educate people about Bernie Sanders' campaign was a very frequent question, right? It was almost never asked, and indeed when the question was raised, there was a real hostility to it. What are we getting wrong? What about our story and our narrative isn't quite right, or at the very least could stand to be supplemented with additional information? What is it about the story that the voters we are not reaching? What are they getting right that we're missing? Let me give you one more example of what I'm talking about, and this is a more extreme one. Nina Turner is one of, she's actually originally a Clinton person, but she fell out with Clinton for whatever reason and became one of Bernie Sanders' most sort of prominent surrogates, and represented him on media, so on, very active in new media supporting him. She was running for a congressional seat in a primary with sort of against a normie mainline Dem from sort of a lefty perspective. Both of these are black women, and the electorate, I think, is majority black. Initially, Nina Turner was ahead, at least in polling, and primary electorate polling's all over the place. But she had some name recognition and sort of local support, which often lefty candidates don't, and she had the entire leftist messaging and fundraising apparatus behind her, which is considerable, like lefties can fundraise. What lost it for her? She refused to say, and she refused to say on multiple occasions, if she'd voted for Hillary in 2016. She was someone who was on Bernie's side then, was incredibly critical of Hillary, I think never endorsed Hillary, and then we don't know if she was a Bernie or bust person or secretly voted for her. Presumably she didn't vote for Hillary, because otherwise why not just say that? She also compared voting for Biden in 2020 to, and I'll just quote directly, eating a bowl of shit, end quote. And those two things tanked her. The opposition, a woman named Brown, just put it on every leaflet, refused to say if she voted in 2016, compared voting for Biden to eating shit. Every leaflet made sure every primary voter knew that, and she lost. Now, to my mind, that is overwhelmingly clear why she lost. But she said it was an establishment stitch-up against her, that it had been rigged, that it was because all this money was on the other side, whereas in fact spending was quite even. Like I say, the Bernie wing of the party can fundraise, no one can take that away from them. That to me seems a very clear instance. Look, challenging an incumbent is always a bit of an uphill ladder, to mix my metaphors, but that seems a very clear case where anti-Dem messaging cost you an election, just straightforward to me. And there's all sorts of lesser examples of that where it hasn't maybe lost it, but it's not helped, right? To be competitive in primaries, or to even hold the odd seat they do win, the left needs to drop rhetoric that reads as insufficiently anti-Trump to mainline libs. This is the AOC path. I mentioned AOC kind of moved up quadrants. The reason mainline libs love her is she's credibly signalled that she gets it. She has said again and again, and I think she means it, Trump cannot win at any cost. And that's why she's okay, and that's why she's held her seat. This is why, let's just say, online activists on the left are much, much less powerful than Republican ones. Republicans fear their Twitter shitposters. Democrats don't. Because the leverage these activists have is we'll whip up the primary electorate against you and primary you. But because of this divide, everyone basically understands that that's a bluff. Dems don't fear them. And I don't think that's a good thing. It makes the party slow-moving and sclerotic. It makes it impervious to feedback. Ideally, people who, the sort of quote-unquote class of people who rant about politics online would work with the Democratic primary electorate to provide a bit of oversight and accountability to politicians, because even people who are fairly political, who are within this sort of 40 million subcategory that I've talked about, they're not going to follow the minutiae of, like, this drama we just had with the spending bill. They sort of rely on the real nerds to follow it for them and to say, this person, talks a good game but hasn't been all right. This person actually is kind of overlooked. We have, this is maybe inflating us a little bit, but we have an important role to play in democratic accountability, and we're not playing it right now because we can't talk to the primary electorate because we're talking quite different languages. And actually, it's not a matter of educating the primary electorate. This is something that the left is getting wrong. The narrative that Trump is actually about economic anxiety is not true. Also, if the left could have an election where they took some scalps, did what the Tea Party did, right? Flipped 50 seats in Congress, humiliated some Dems in leadership, that would have, if nothing else, let off some steam. They could feel their own influence. Because the left aren't nobody. You know, they're millions of people. They have a voice. They just don't have enough votes to really decide elections, and they don't have enough of a voice to set the agenda. They're in a frustrating position, and to a degree you can sympathise with them, where they have just enough influence to have to be taken seriously, but not so much that they can determine anything. It's a frustrating position for everybody. And I think we needed an opportunity to let off some steam. And because they haven't been able to do that, and because Dems can just say, well, go fuck yourself, and they kind of do, they've become increasingly insular and increasingly angry. Here's what you'd have to do, according to this model, and I think frankly common sense. If there is to be a Democratic Tea Party, you want to ask everything you write, is this an agental or a non-agental narrative for the right? You want to market yourself as being more anti-Trump than your opponent. Ask yourself, in any messaging, who is blaming Trump more? Ask it of the Biden and the Bernie speeches. Who's blaming Trump more? Bernie's blaming Trump a bit. Biden's blaming him more. An almost universal rule of thumb when it comes to inter-left disputes is whoever's blaming Trump more will win. You want to run as being more pro-Democratic Party, not less. So, for instance, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, has recently really sold the Democratic Party out and backed a Republican spending bill with no compromises, much to the anger of Democrats in the House. Both lefties like AOC and mainline Dems like Hakeem Jeffries are furious with him. Will this produce a primary challenge? I don't know. 2-3 years until his election is a long time. New Yorkers are just about to elect Andrew Cuomo, so clearly they have short memories. But if you were to run against Schumer, you don't want to run on a message of Dems are feckless and this proves it. You want to run on a message of Schumer sold out the party to Trump and I won't. I'll stand up for our values and he won't. Remember always that the Dem primary electorate are not your online politics people. Make your message for offline, mainline libs, who, I want to stress, agree with you on almost all matters of policy. You have to rhetorically and narratively compromise. That's, well, in my view, I think that's the good news, because I think you should narratively compromise. In your view, probably the bad news, because you don't want to narratively compromise. But the good news from both of our view is you really don't need to substantively compromise. That's the good news. And on paper, that sounds easy. But in practice, it really goes against the grain. The online left are raised at yelling at Dems. It's what they know, and they get angry when you tell them to stop doing it. It feels like you're apologising for power to them. I recall someone saying once in a discussion, when I made this point, that if lefties dropped the anti-Dem messaging, how would they be able to tell, quote-unquote, our people from regular Dem representatives? In other words, if we elected a lefty who didn't always yell about Dems being useless, how would we know that they were really a lefty? And they were so much more right than they knew. I'll finally say that if you want mainline libs to trust you, to vote for your people in primaries, you have to stop threatening not to vote in generals. At a minimum, an engaged Democratic primary electorate, not snooty Dem consultants, but regular liberal women, older black people, middle-aged liberals. They are never, ever, ever, ever going to vote for an unapologetic Bernie or Buster. If you cannot even say if you voted for Hillary in 2016, they will never go for you, ever. And I can say that almost to a certainty. The main thing for this electorate is that they loathe and fear Trump. If you were not willing to cast a ballot against him, they will not go for you. And you might think they're wrong to have that red line, but that is their red line. At any rate, that is the choice. And that is more or less what I've been saying in my analysis of the 2020 primary and so on for a long time. I can describe it for you. I can make it easier for people to adapt. I can call in rather than call out. But I can't make that choice for you. That is a choice that this section of the left has to make for itself. Does it want to compromise on narrative and win and have power? Or does it want to hold on to its anti-agental narrative? Next part, the fifth. Reactionary centrists. And I'm going to be short here because what the fuck is up with these guys? They really, 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 really soured on Biden. They complained about ending the Afghan war, about debt, about inflation, now increasingly about trans people. Now, descriptively, all of this is wrong. Not unlike the left, actually, their core non-agental claims don't appear to be falsifiable. Reactionary centrists should look at the 2016 and the 2024 Democratic platform and find a lot to like. There were aggressive appeals to moderates in both of those campaigns, and they both lost. What else are they asking us to do? Likewise, of course, you can say that, anti-establishment leftism usually fails even within a primary electorate and definitely fails within a general electorate. See the various races for Congress they've lost in generals, or see someone like Jeremy Corbyn, and that doesn't faze them either. Both of them seem to be non-falsifiable at the level of elections. With that said, the anti-establishment left at least have a narrative, they at least have a set of things that they want. I don't think the reactionary centrists even have that. I think these people are really confused because on the other quadrants that aren't the same as me, I can at least sort of say what I think is driving them and what their story is here. Like I say, for the anti-establishment left, there's a story about the underlying villain is neoliberalism, and that kind of complicates anti-Trump opposition. I don't agree, but there's a narrative there. And I thought about this a bit, what is the core narrative or set of claims that the reactionary centrists want? And I realised ultimately, I think trying to even assess it on those terms gives them too much credit. There isn't a core narrative at the heart of reactionary centrism. There are two key drivers, a desire to be in the middle and a deference to power. For the desire to be in the middle, they want to be able to position themselves as above the fray, smarter than anyone else in the room. Yes, I see this, but what you have to consider is this. Yes, of course, you think that as a liberal, but I can see both sides, and I would say this. If the fascists say trans people are destroying Western civilization, and the liberals say, I don't know, we basically don't have a problem with them, the truth is probably somewhere in between. Trans people are probably, a bit dangerous, according to them. Someone online, Alan Richardson, described it as follows. And I quote, "It's mainly a reasonableness norm. The reasonable person sits between opposing views and sees their point of views. In virtue of this, he occupies a position of the truth. It is unmoored from any decent account of truth or reason. Hegelian synthesis, but by averaging." End quote. I love that. Hegelian synthesis, but by averaging. Yeah. Their view is sort of what makes it true is that it's in the middle. The other thing I think is deference to power. They soured on Trump when it became clear towards the end of his term that he was going to lose re-election in 2020, this is. And then suddenly once he'd lost election, they were able to summon a bit of stomach in negatively reporting on his attempts to stay in office and coup attempt and so on. As the pendulum has shifted, however, they now increasingly see Trump as the ascendant power, and so cozy up to that. And I think it's those two things, and I think it's not that much more complicated than that. The only final thing I'll add is I think they just want to be paid attention to. They want to be told how smart and clever they are. A big problem they had with Biden, apparently, was access. Biden's administration wasn't forever leaking internal gossip to them in the way Trump was, and that upset them. They want to be given their interviews. They want to get their off-the-record quotes, and when you don't play ball, they will burn you. Apparently that was a big part of it as well. All of this brings us to Dems going forward. I've been very critical of the left through my description in this model. Now, to balance things out, let me be critical of the Democratic Party. I think this helps understand the strategic motivation behind the current Dem weak messaging. For example, them caving on the spending bill, but also someone like Gavin Newsom or Rahm Emanuel attacking trans people and saying that very reactionary centrist messaging, maybe it was because of trans people that we lost the election. Here's, I think, sort of what they're thinking there, and in advance I think they're wrong to think this. Dems held, more or less, all of these quadrants in 2020. Following the revolt of the anti-establishment left in 2016, the Bernie movement and then the Bernie or Bust movement, they put a lot of effort into holding that quadrant. Biden took on and passed a lot of progressive policies. This alienated the reactionary centrists who fret about debt and inflation and bipartisanship, and as I said, we just didn't put as much work into holding that section. Biden was contemptuous of the press, and perhaps deservedly, but still. And then, of course, Israel-Gaza happens. My read is I think many on the anti-establishment left have been drifting that way anyway, i.e. towards not liking Biden and the Dems. And I think even if this war hadn't have happened, they might still have exited, but it provided a very firm rationale for them withdrawing support. So we go into the 2024 election with both bottom quadrants, not only not with them, but actively messaging against them. From Dems' point of view, they've tried holding the left, but nothing they did cut through with them. So now they have to try and mend relations with the reactionary centrists. To be clear, I'm not saying this is right. I'm saying I think this is how some Dems are seeing it. I know some people vaguely in the party, and they've come to the view that the left will always message against them, and that 2020 was a one-off, and that nothing can appease them. This is too strong. But it's not completely wrong either. Part of what defines this segment is that they at least partially blame Democrats for Trump. What does that mean? Well, you can see the thought process, right? This is a Democrat speaking. What do these people want? Civility? Bipartisanship? They're really frickin' worked up about trans people in sports? Okay, we'll give them that. We'll be civil and bipartisan. We'll throw trans people under the bus. Maybe that will make the media environment less hostile. Now, there's a lot to say about that morally, but one thing I'll just say here is I don't think it will work. The anti-trans people are insane. They can't be appeased. Look at the UK Labour Party, who has really substantively abandoned trans people, to no obvious gain with Conservatives and to the frustration of many Liberals. And I think most Dems, to their credit, get that much, but a few are floating it. I think that's also the reason across the party we've gone from a measured but clear Trump is a threat to the Republic to more just messaging. Reactionary centrists hate clearly stated values. They hate blaming Trump for what it does. They want civility, always directed left and down. And I think this is what that debt ceiling cave was about. Schumer immediately went like a cat with a bird in its teeth and wrote an article for the New York Times about it. The bastion of reactionary centrism. That's who this was for. But it won't work. And I think clearly won't work, right? For one thing, it unites all three of the other quadrants against you. For the people in the top two quadrants, our main thing is hating Trump, and if you're not sufficiently opposing him, we'll be against you. For the anti-establishment left, they hate Trump, but they also hate Dems, so if this is a chance to bash Dems, they're going to be against you. For another thing, I don't think reactionary centrists do have any rational desires in a normal sense. They take the mean, right? If they're averaging right now between trans people are an existential threat and they're fine actually, going to like they're a little bit of a threat will weirdly actually push the reactionary centrists to the right. It'll just, whatever the mean is, will just become more hostile. Finally, they follow power. Dems are at a low ebb right now. Our coverage will improve when our power does. And yeah, if you want to say that kind of feels like a vicious circle, yeah, this is the thing. Power and powerlessness compound. Power begets more power. Powerlessness begets more powerlessness. That's always been true. Finally, remember that this is all about coverage and tone. Reactionary centrists do not represent any voters. The problem here is purely one of messaging power. And this is killing the Dems, right? This is what's killing us, is the Republican Party has both new and old media messaging apparatus to amplify everything they say. The Democratic Party has neither. It's lost both of them. And that is absolutely unsustainable. It's a miracle we only lost 6 million votes, honestly. That's how loyal our core base is. So what do we do? Again, I don't have any magic bullets. We are in a complicated and compounding situation where a lot of different things are getting wrong. But thinking about it through this model, what would it suggest that we do? The first thing, obviously, is to build up lib messaging power, online and traditional. That is a lot of work, but we have to start somewhere. Both because I think that section of the electorate is largely right, and I want that view out there, but also because just thinking about everything we've worked through, this messaging mismatch is causing all sorts of structural problems right now within the coalition. In my experience, as sort of a mainline lib, making a social media politics product, there is just like no support either from above or below. If I was doing something that was social justice critical, you would get the big accounts who have like 1 million followers. They really pull people up after them on the right. They'll notice you. You'll do the podcast tour. If I'm taking off in the anti-trans space, say, and like making videos that catch traction, I'll get invited on the right-wing talk circuit. And that'll grow me and so on. There's also money coming from above on the right and funding. None of that really on the left. The right pay their propagandists. The left don't. To the extent that we fund stuff, it's either our subscriptions to the New York Times, i.e. we fund reactionary centrists, or we fund anti-establishment lefties. Like I say, they generally have the dominant space on new media platforms. For mainline liberals, that means there's no either grassroots support of people funding you from below or people pulling you up from above. Like you're really just screaming into the void. So if this sounds like I'm ending this with a plea for support, actually kind of, yeah, I am. Follow the podcast, give to the podcast, give to Liberal Currents where I write. We just need support right now. For the reactionary centrists, I think the best you can do here is a soft pivot, not a hard. What I mean by that is maintain relationships. I think relationships are big for these people. I think they want to feel important and special. Give them their little tidbits. Give them their gossip. Go on their podcasts, and this does win them over. Work the refs. Republicans have made an art form about complaining about biased coverage. There is no reason Democrats can't do that too, especially because liberals fund them. Anyone who gives money to the New York Times is an educated liberal. Let's exercise that power. But don't hard pivot, that is substantively capitulate. I just don't think that will work, and we need to maintain a sense of what we're fighting for. Don't capitulate, but it does feel to me like in many ways mainline liberalism is a creed no longer making new converts. We have to sell ourselves. We have to have a bit of intellectual courage. That's the takeaway for liberals. We are profoundly failing right now in terms of getting our message out, and it's causing structural problems within the coalition. The message to anti-establishment left? Pretty simple. If you want to exercise more power, the way to do that is through the primary system. If you want to win primaries, you need to understand that mainline liberals are the primary electorate. You have to meet us halfway with that. Message to anti-Trump centre? No, you guys are cool. I'm sure we agree about all sorts of stuff, but we disagree about all sorts of stuff. But honestly, you haven't been shaking us down for your votes every election. You've more or less been loyally in the coalition. You don't bring enough numbers with you to make that really worth anything, but, cool. Nice to have you around. Anti-Trump centre message to them is not really safe to say publicly. Stop being dipshits would be a polite version of it. You are endangering the Republic. You are behaving in a fantastically irresponsible and immoral way, and could you please stop? One of the ironies of the left assuming that the reactionary centrists are liberals is there is no one we hate more. That is the opposite quadrant to us. We have nothing in common. They both do not share my values or my view of Trump. So anyway, those are my takeaways for everyone. Isn't that nice and cheery? I think all of that would be a start. I think liberals taking on a responsibility to persuade, a responsibility to get our message out there would help. I think lefties engaging with the Democratic Party more sensibly would be a good thing. Will all that happen? Probably not. But I'd stress that this is all choices that we're making, and we can choose differently. Unlike what is happening on the right, this is something we can control. We are choosing to undermine ourselves day after day, and we can stop at any time.